Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Lisa Sawsville. I'm the Executive Director of Vermont Coverts, Woodlands for Wildlife. Thank you for Zooming with us today as we host Dr. Noah Charney, who's the author of These Trees Tell a Story. We're excited to host this event and dive into how we can read ecological stories in the landscape. For those of you who don't know Dr. Charney, he's an ecologist, conservation biologist, and professor at the University of Maine who has worked extensively on understanding forests and their changes over time. In this book, These Trees Tell a Story, he shows us how to read the clues connecting us to the complex interactions between land, climate, and wildlife. This event is brought to you by Vermont Coverts, and our organization works with Vermont landowners and others to promote wildlife conservation and forest stewardship. Through our Coverts Cooperator training, the workshops and events we do, we empower landowners with the knowledge and tools they need to manage their forests sustainably and to support wildlife habitat. If you're inspired by our work and program like today's, we invite you to consider supporting Vermont Coverts. Every donation makes a meaningful impact on our mission and fosters healthy, resilient woodlands that benefit wildlife and communities alike. You can do so on our website at www.vtcoverts.org. This program is being recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. Please be sure to mute yourselves and avoid background noise, and type any questions into the chat box that you might have, and I'll ask those to Noah at the end. With that, again, thank you for joining, and Noah, I turn it over to you.
Great, thanks so much. It's always fun to be part of Vermont Coverts, which, I came like 10 to 15 years ago, and it was really a great time. It's a great organization. So, yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about this book, which I believe maybe some of you have read, some of you haven't. I'll try to share some things that aren't in it that were part of behind the scenes, and then some stuff that's in it too. If you haven't read it and don't like reading words, there is an Audible audio version of it, which I actually prefer to listen to things also. And it's got a person, Douglas Pratt, who has a much deeper voice than I do, and maybe is nicer to listen to. So I recommend getting that if you want to do it that way. And if you want the pictures and the images that go along with that, they're actually all on the website. So you can sort of hear the words in your head and then download the pictures to kind of follow along. So I'm going to start here. When I was doing research for the book, I traveled around and sort of collecting stories and landscapes. And for part of the time I went down to Tennessee. This is my friend's land outside of Nashville, and he's a great naturalist. And he has this farmland that he's managed for all wildlife, and he's been burning it for birds and for quail, I believe. And we were walking across through his land along these sort of dirt logging roads, or really farm roads, where he could drive his pickup truck. And we were walking along these roads. I had my two kids in the double stroller, and we were checking his wildlife cameras. He had we were looking at pictures of all the bobcats and things that he had taken. We were checking them as we went. We walked down to the river and saw some raccoon tracks in the mud, and went through the soybean fields. And we got up to the edge of this forest and field, right along the edge of the transition there, where there was a intersection between two of the dirt roads. And John was up ahead of me and looking down at the ground, and he calls back to me, and he's like, hey Noah, I want you to look at something. I found a scat here, because he knows that I love poop and stuff. And he's like, hey, I think it's a raccoon scat. And I can't see it. I'm like back behind my double stroller with my two kids, like 30 meters behind, so I can't see the actual poop. But I know it's not a raccoon scat. John had seen it the day before. That's why he thought it was a raccoon scat. He'd taken a picture of it, taken it back to his house, and looked up on like Google Images and saw that the scat on Google Images of raccoon kind of looked like his picture. So they kind of looked the same. But the thing is, like, that location at a trail intersection between like a forest and field edge is just not the place where the raccoon would ever put her scat. Sure, a raccoon may have walked by there, like the raccoon whose tracks we saw down by the creek, but she put her scat like on the uphill side of a hemlock or something down by the creek. That location there is a territorial marking, or some sort of marking spot where a coyote would put her scat. And so when I got up to it and checked the scat, sure enough, yeah, it was a coyote. It looked a little funny. It had been eating a bunch of apples. So it was a little strange looking, but John's mistake was that, to identify a scat, you don't start by looking at it. You look at the context, you think about where it is, and you don't really look at the thing until you really know the environment around. And, Sue Morse has this maximum tracking. She's a great tracker, and she says, half of tracking is knowing where to look, the other half is looking there. Nowhere in there is like, what does the thing look like? It's understanding your context, understanding where you are in space, which is something that I think, we are increasingly not so good at, and something I'm trying to instill in folks. I worked down in Nashville for a couple decades on sort of have this little nonprofit and worked in conservation down there. And, as part of with a bunch of other nonprofits together, the coalition has done things like created this open space plan for the city of Nashville. And I don't know how many folks have ever been to Nashville. It's a cool city. It's where I grew up. And it was a lot quieter when I was a kid, but it's also one of the largest land areas, metro areas in all of the country. It's got, I forget the statistic. I think it's something like 250 square miles of closed canopy forest within the metro limits. I might have that stat wrong, but it's something really big like that. And we got this open space vision officially passed through the Metro Council, which lays out sort of the core conservation areas of the forest we're trying to protect, and these corridors that link between the core areas. And so I want to zoom in on one of them, the Richland Creek corridor right here. And this is Richland Creek. And right here is what I call the Nito Bridgeway. It's Nito because when I was a kid, my mom would pick me up from school and we'd drive down this road here, and we used to be able to turn, and she'd drive over here. You used to be able to drive across this railroad track here. You see, it's like they took out that road a few years ago. But we drive across and get to the little bridge there, and she'd stop the car, and I'd get out and look over the bridge, and she'd ask me to count how many turtles I could see from the bridge. And there would be lots of turtles, sometimes like a dozen or more turtles, different species like map turtles, soft-shelled turtles, box turtles, snapping turtles, turtles that today are on the official list of species in greatest need of conservation in the state of Tennessee. So these are species we're like really interested in protecting. Other things too, green herons and all sorts of cool plants. It's one of my favorite wildlife viewing spots ever. And so a few years back, I went to take my kids to experience this sacred part of my childhood back to the Nito Bridgeway. And we got to the side, went down the part of the road that was still open, and got to the road, and we found this sign. And I was like, wait, what do you mean closed road? This is a public road. How could this be? And I did some digging, and it turns out that the city of Nashville, which owned this road, had just given it away to the two abutting landowners for free. And this went through like 5 different committees, and it had to go through 3 different readings of council. And it's played out over, actually, it was a 2-stage process. So it did each of these things twice. So like 10 different committee meetings and 6 different readings of council over 2 years. And apparently nowhere along the way did anybody raise their hand and say, wait a minute, this isn't a good idea. Here we have like a piece of land, the kind of land that conservationists are fighting tooth and nail to protect. It's like codified as like part of our open space vision. And we're like, we own it, and we're just gonna give it away. And I don't really necessarily fault the decision makers who are, at the committee, the commission, planning, this is the planning commission there. And actually one of these folks is actually works with our nonprofit and our conservation nonprofit. And these are mostly well-intentioned, environmental minded sorts of folks, but they were looking at maps that look like this. These are these sort of black and white plat maps. And, remember how this end of the road had been cut off recently? So it's now a dead end road. So from a sort of traffic perspective, this road is valueless. It doesn't like give anything to us when we're looking at these sorts of data, these sorts of information. And so sure, give it away. Obviously what's missing on here is the sort of environmental context, the ecological flows, what's around here, the creek and the turtles and all that stuff isn't mapped. So I think this is a big part of like the problem, or some of the problems we have, is not having good awareness of the context of the environment, of the decisions we're making and how they're impacting not only human traffic, but ecological flows. And I think this is part of a larger problem as we, navigate spaces. If we want to get from point A to point B, it used to be you take out a map and sort of figure out where you're going. You have to look at the map and think about turn right, turn left. These days, if I want to go from point A to point B, I just have my phone tell me where to go. I turn off my brain and it tells me turn right, turn left, and I don't think anymore. I don't even form a map of the space in my head. When I was doing my grad work, I went to like 500 or more ponds in the Berkshires, and I was following this GPS the whole time. And so I like know all these ponds, but like when I go back there, I have no idea where they are relative to each other because I was letting the GPS do the thinking for me. And I never formed a map of the Berkshires in my head. So, when we let the machines think for us, we don't do the hard work of understanding the space. And so we just don't know it. This is true, I think, when we use Google Maps, when we use Seek. I'm sure folks hopefully have used AI to like identify species. It's incredibly useful. Merlin and all these things, I've been using them. I find it a great learning tool, but it also, again, takes away that moment of like how many petals, like is this opposite or alternate? Is it like where I get to really understand the species and know what I'm looking at? And with ChatGPT, we kind of don't have to think anymore about anything. My students just write papers by having ChatGPT write it for them. So all these tools are incredibly useful, incredibly fun, but also really terrifying to me in terms of like what we're losing and what we're giving away to the machines. And I think it's problematic. So what this book that I wrote is based on a course that I used to teach, which was actually came from a course at the University of Vermont Field Naturalist Program, which I think they borrowed some things from Tom Sigma at Yale. And so there's sort of a tradition of this type of course where we go out and to the opposite of using ChatGPT, we go into nature and we get to know it personally and we interact with it and we build relationships with each other and with nature. And it was one of the best things I ever did in terms of a job. We take the students, 10 students or 12 students into the van, like the mystery machine on Fridays, and go out, find some place where we'd gone all day and there'd be some mystery that we'd encounter. And the students would have to decode the mystery, had to tell the story of the landscape, learning to read the landscape. And so what do I mean by read the landscape? So I'll give you an example in my backyard. When you look in the backyard, there's some patterns that tell stories. So throughout the forest, there's hemlocks all throughout the understory, but there are no hemlocks in the canopy. And this pattern tells a story, and I'll get back to that in a second. There's another pattern, which is if you dig a hole anywhere in the yard, it just keeps going through this nice soft soil as far as you can reach. It's where our garden grows, but you don't find any rocks in there. There are no rocks in our yard. But if you take a walk up the hill behind our house, within about 10, 20 seconds, you start passing lots and lots of rocks. There are rocks everywhere. These are, of course, the footprints of the glaciers. When the glaciers melted 10,000 years ago, they left behind glacial till, these rocks everywhere. It's why the farmers had to haul them out of their fields 200 years ago and line their fields with stone walls. So why aren't there rocks in our front yard? Well, when the glaciers melted in this area, they left behind a glacial lake, Lake Hitchcock. And that our house must have been below lake level, where for thousands of years, layer after layer of lake bottom sediment buried those rocks. It built up that garden soil. So we sit up on this hill looking out, imagining we're still looking out across that ancient lake. And we like to say our house is beachfront property. It's just that the lake has been gone for 10,000 years. So when we look at the stone wall, there's another thing we notice is that there's no small rocks in there. We suggest that this was sheep pasture up here, not like not farm fields. When I would have done the same thing, right? To keep the garden down in our nice lake bottom sediment down in our yard, and up here have the sheep pasture in this sort of rocky acidic soil where there's lots of pines, there's partridge berries, and up here you actually have that same pattern of hemlocks in the understory, and in this case it's pines in the canopy. And this is, of course, the classic story of forest succession. When the sheep pasture was abandoned, the winged pine seeds flew out across the field And the pines grow up straight and tall, and pines love the sun. But the thing about pines is they can't grow in the shade of their own canopy. Hemlocks, on their hand, are sort of slow growing. They love the shade, and they sit down there waiting for the pines to die, waiting to turn this into a hemlock forest. And there's this middle layer of small birches next to these cut stumps that tell of a logging event a few decades ago where someone cut some of the pines, making gaps in the canopy where the birches love to grow. So there's all these layers in the forest that tell us about the past, that tell us about the future, that tell us about where to plant your garden, where to have the sheep, where to find the partridge berry, and all these layers, in the rocks and the soil and the trees, it's more than just like knowing where things are. To me, I think we can better manage our landscapes if we understand these things, but I also think it's about like connecting. And there's this storytelling, this like just really fun thing when you connect with nature and you tell these stories and your place in it, that I really, really enjoy about this kind of like getting to know a place. So, oops.
And if we lose your phone, then we lose your phone.
Where my kids afterwards took my phone and buried it in the dirt and said, if we lose your phone, we lose your phone. That was fun to make that video. All right, so our front yard here is, I don't know if this is our yard right here. This is our neighbor's yard. You guys probably know about wild landscaping sort of stuff where we kind of let our yard go wild. And our yard is kind of a mess, but we love it. It's got lots of like solitary bees that live in the broken stems of the sumac and lots of different habitat. We don't rake our leaves because the leaf litter is, where the pollinators overwinter. And if we were to rake them and burn them or throw them in the dump, we'd be throwing away all our pollinators. So we like to keep that habitat around. And we love all the little leaf miners and other bugs that sort of live in all the jungle of different leaves and plants in our yard. And you can get really into it. Actually, for a previous book that I wrote one of these books with Charlie Eisman last time we were at Vermont Coverts. We got really into the tracks and sign of insects. When you start looking up close, there's this whole world to discover there of all the little native insects that live on the native plants. We like that the thing about native plants is they have more of the native insects, which probably. And there was a study done by Desiree Narango showing that when she went out to neighborhoods that had more non-native shrubs and neighborhoods that had less non-native shrubs, so more native things. And in the areas where there were more non-natives, there weren't as many bugs. And so when she looked at the chickadee mamas couldn't find enough bugs to feed their babies. So the babies actually starved to death. So there was this, not only do we have the invasive, the native plants support the bugs, those bugs support the birds. So there's sort of like cascading effects. Another good example of this is in Phoenix, sort of classic example of different ways of landscaping your own yard. This is sort of the native xeric type landscaping, dry desert cacti and things like that. Some folks try to recreate like Baltimore out in Arizona there. They water their lawn a lot and have lots of big trees. And then some folks are sort of too poor to have much going on and end up with these sort of barren dirt lots. And my friend Susanna Lerman did her dissertation work out there looking at the birds. And she found that the native birds, the native sort of endemic desert species, went to the xeric yards, and these cosmopolitan sort of nuisance type birds like pigeons and house sparrows were in the other lots that weren't landscaped like deserts. And when she was walking around, folks would come up to her in these neighborhoods, the xeric neighborhoods, and when they find out she was an ornithologist, they'd be like, "Oh, you're an ornithologist. You study birds. I love my birds. Like, let's talk about the grackles and the thrashers and the roadrunners and all the things." And then when she'd go to these neighborhoods, they'd come up to her and be like, "Oh, you're an ornithologist. You study birds. How do I get rid of my birds? They poop on things. They're loud. They're noisy. I hate them." And so the things we do in our yard affect things, the plants, the birds. That comes back and we respond to that, and it affects sort of our feelings about the nature itself too. So we've heard a lot about invasive species. I'm sure invasives are bad. This is this one place, one chapter in my book that I call the orchard. It's an abandoned orchard in the corner of the university. And this place is just overrun with invasives: privet, multiflora rose, bittersweet, all the sort of noxious, invasive sort of target list species we're trying to eradicate. And so for one chapter of this book, I was trying to get a picture of every creature I could find in the orchard. And so we went there all winter, visiting it over and over again. And the whole winter, there was this massive cleanup effort, the grounds crew trying to get rid of like the invasives, get rid of the privet and the bittersweet, clean it up. And I wondered that whole winter if my heart was the only one that kind of broke watching this cleanup effort, because the orchard is a place that lives really deep in me. For about 11 years, 11 winters, Charlie, the guy who I wrote that insect tracking book with, he and I taught this winter tracking course. And we'd always start in the orchard for one particular species. When you go into the orchard, first you find what we call rabbitat. It's this multiflora rose thicket that the bunnies like to hang out through winter. And here we're talking about Eastern cottontail mainly. It used to be like New England cottontail, but then Eastern cottontail, they're actually a Midwestern import, but they sort of displaced them largely. But the bunnies down there hang out down there eating the multiflora rose. And up above that, there's lots of berries of the rose and the bittersweet and other things that all winter long the birds feast on. And you'll get these like flocks of robins in the winter hanging out there. And I remember one winter we were out teaching this tracking course, and Charlie was there telling about bird language in this cacophony of robins. And the bird language is the idea that if you listen to the birds, they'll tell you something about what's going on in nature. And so he's saying they're telling this, the birds are making really loud, and all of a sudden the birds went quiet and this hush fell over the orchard. And we waited for a minute. And then a Cooper's hawk came gliding low overhead. And we're like, aha, that's what the birds were telling us. So the berries feed the little creatures, the bunnies and birds, and then those feed the bigger creatures like the Cooper's hawks. And on Christmas Day, it snowed about, I don't know, 6 inches or something. And we went out there to check the wildlife camera we had set up to catch pictures of the animals. And I went out with my son Juno, who was, I don't know, maybe 4 at the time. And his legs were sort of too small for the snow. So I had to kind of post hole in front of him. I would step down and he would step in my tracks the way, like a coyote will do, stepping in her own tracks to save energy. And in fact, sometimes you'll be following a coyote trail and suddenly it'll branch off into like 3 different coyotes that were all following the same footprint, stepping in each other's tracks. So Juno looks up to me and he says, "Hey, Dada, you and me, we're coyotes." And I'm like, "Yeah." And so we get up to the trail camera and I put my laptop down in the snow and pull out the SD card, put it in my computer, hoping to see a picture. Well, we figured we'd see a picture of actually us walking up to the camera because we just like walked up to it. But we didn't see a picture of us. What we saw was this. And on some level, we truly believe that we transformed into that coyote and we howled all the way back to the car. So we got pictures of coyote, which are your Eastern coyote, really, which are a modern invention. A couple hundred or 100 years ago, there were just Western coyotes, and then we had wolves. We killed off all the wolves. The coyotes marched east, interbreeding with dogs and wolves to become this new thing, bigger and more pack-like than the Western coyote. We also got pictures of red fox, and I actually have this a little bit wrong in my book. I cited the right thing, but said it a little bit wrong. But red fox are largely a native species, but they were imported from Europe for fox hunting, and there's been recent genetic work showing probably most of the red fox we have around here are probably mostly still our native strains, but there's been some questions and work on like how much is native versus like European red fox versus the native one. Historically, they're mostly more of a boreal species here, and the expansion may have just been changes in habitat more than genetic influences. And then we also got pictures of gray fox, which is a fully native species. They're sort of like semi-cat-like in a way. Cool species there in the orchard. So when Charlie and I are teaching this winter tracking course, we usually start out in the deep woods of Western Massachusetts, which I don't know how much time you spent there, but they're really great, a lot like Vermont's and big woods too. And out there in the deep woods, every day, every few days, we might come across the tracks of a bobcat. And we'd be like, aha, our favorite species, let's follow it. So we'd get on the trail and we'd start following it through the woods. And inevitably, it's going to lead us to some like abandoned beaver meadow or some overgrown thicket of like rose or blackberry or some shrubby, horrible place, the thicket of pines is really hard to get through, where they like to hunt and hang out. And, you know, it'd be some horrible place that's a thicket like the orchard. And it's really, bobcat is the reason we go to the orchard, because, you know, it's the one place we can always go and always find bobcat. It's like the densest population of bobcats I've ever seen anywhere. And it may not be that there's many cats there. It may just be the one family of cats we've been following for a couple decades. It's just that they have everything they need there. They've got the thickets to hide in. They've got the bunnies to eat. Why go anywhere else? So when you look at the orchard, maybe you see a horrible thicket of invasives that need to be eliminated. Or maybe you see bobcats. Maybe you see the bobcats you've been following for a couple decades. And when you get to know the species and the creatures in a place, suddenly maybe it's not that the invasives are bad. Maybe they're also serving a function for some species, and we can sort of reframe how we're thinking about them. You know, a mile or so away from the orchard, there's this famous salamander crossing spot where I don't know how many folks have participated in big night salamander crossings, but every spring the spotted salamanders come out and they cross the roads, and the kids come with their families and help them across the roads. There's actually a tunnel built there that they can sort of make sure that salamanders go into the tunnel. And, you know, it's not like spotted salamanders are particularly rare. There's probably over 30,000 populations of them in Massachusetts alone. And on the way to helping these salamanders cross the road, I suspect some salamanders are getting squished under tires in other populations that are less known. But the thing I love about this, it's this, you know, point of connection between nature and the community. And really it's about that child holding an individual salamander in her hands and relating to that individual and building a connection and a relationship with an individual creature. And to me, that's sort of what this whole thing is about. It's about building relationships with individual places, with individual creatures, and sort of being a part of that relationship. So the book is about following this class through the 10 different sites or so in the Connecticut River Valley that we visited. And in each of these places, we form a relationship, we get to know its story, and we get to know our place in the story. I think many of you have sort of read the book to some extent, and so you may be familiar with this sort of first mystery here, which if you look at this, there's a pattern. And if you haven't seen this before, you can think real quickly about what the pattern is and what you're looking at, what sort of things you want to see. But generally the pattern I see here is it's dark over here, it's light over there. And why is that? So there's a visual pattern. Think about like, or it's like light green and dark green. You just look at the woods as sort of a painting, and how would you paint it? And what are the patterns, sort of absent your information about species or any other information, right? And then you start to think, okay, what is that pattern? And you get a little more detail, and then you start to see what are the species that make up that pattern. And then you start to dig down to like, okay, this plant's here, and we look at the different pieces, and we can think about what sorts of processes might drive those patterns. So we have, you know, white ash, basswood, and hog peanut over here, American chestnut, chestnut oak, paper birch over there. And so, okay, we've got our species in like into these different places, and we can start to think, okay, why is this one here? Why is that one there? And the processes that you might think of, like first one that could come to mind, some folks probably think, is you look at the compass there and you think, all right, there's different directions of these hills. And so the sunlight, you know, in the northern hemisphere, the sun is always in the south, right? It's at noon, it's due south, but the rest of the time it's sort of in the southern part of the sky. And, you know, so which means that any slope that's facing south is going to get that direct sunlight. It's going to heat up. get real hot and dry. And so you'll get a bunch of species there, a community that likes those hot, dry conditions. Whereas the North Slope is facing away from the sun, and it'll be more moist and cool and darker, shadier sorts of species. So when you look at this, you should see the difference between moist and dry. And when you look at the slopes, you see, well, this is north facing, this is south facing. So this should have the sun. Wait, then so this is south facing. This should have the dry species. So did I mix this up? Well, no. It's that the sun, this isn't the explanation of the pattern, that there's something else going on. And so when we dig a little deeper, we see that the rocks are also different beneath these two sides. There's over here, this sharp-edged thing that breaks is for a volcanic rock, it's basalt. This thing with the lots of little pebbles in it is a conglomerate of basaltic sort of sandstone, and actually the smoothed edges and the pinkish color of it tells you a little bit more about where it came from. But generally, so why, let's talk about this volcanic basalt there. Why is there volcanic rock here? Well, you have to go back to when North America and Africa were splitting apart 200 million years ago. As the continents were stretching apart, these sort of like stretch marks formed, and into those stretch marks, lava was bubbling up. And so you have these rift valleys that were forming from North Carolina all the way north, where lava was bubbling up into these like deep lava lakes, like 800-foot deep lava lakes in this area. And that was where like this rift basing was forming in this area, and that was where the Atlantic Ocean was going to form, but it didn't. The rifting was aborted there, and the actual Atlantic Ocean formed east of Boston, and we have an aborted rift valley where the lava just kind of cooled and hardened into this basalt. And then actually you had some more sedimentary layers fall on top of that and some more basalt, so you have this kind of like layering over time. And then you have these layers that in the tumult of plate tectonics and such got tilted. And it just so happens that basalt is more resistant to weathering, from rain and the sort of all the chemical and physical weathering processes. So the basalt kind of stuck out like a mountain there. That's what formed this mountain. And the basalt was over here and the Arcos over here. So you have what we're looking at here, a junction between the basalt and the Arcos, those layers that are sort of turned sideways. And it just so happens that basalt puts a lot of magnesium and micronutrients into the soil that plants really love, which makes for really rich soil. So usually I think of moist places as kind of rich, moist places because lowlands have a lot of water. The water carries nutrients down. Water makes nutrients available to plants. Uplands are often dry, where you have like chestnut oak forests that there's just the water has stripped away the nutrients. Because it's so dry, the plants have trouble accessing nutrients. So usually rich and moist go together. But in this case, we've sort of decoupled these two ideas so that it's actually not the moisture, but the richness that's driving the plant patterns over here. And the sort of rich versus poor soils is opposite the moisture gradient. So those plants tell the story of the rifting of North America 200 million years ago, and setting up the whole valley here of the Connecticut River that, you know, we can tell the rest of the stories into. So when we, go around to these different landscapes, we see different sorts of patterns. Some of them are caused by all sorts of forces like water and fire and rivers and different things. And you see patterns that you then think about, again, the pieces that are there, the pattern that's there, and what is the process underlying it. This, I think, Tom Sycamore is sort of defining of how you pick apart a landscape. You look at the pieces, pattern, and process. I'm just going to walk real quickly through some of the processes that you may look for on a landscape, from the bedrock to surficial deposits, topographic position, landscape context, disturbance history, and values. So real quickly, just to sort of go through these, we talked a little bit about bedrock and how you have different layers that kind of get tilted in plate tectonics. There's weathering that erodes them, and then you have these different places where you might have different plants growing on the different types of rocks. And the water kind of forms these channels into there, eating away more. But the thing is, in in the north here, we had the glaciers that dumped all this glacial till on top of everything. So usually you actually don't see much bedrock influence on plants, like locally. Maybe over large regions you do, like the Berkshires has a lot more sort of calcium-rich minerals because there's a lot of marble there, and so that you see more calcite-loving plants. But on a sort of a local basis, you don't see a lot of like what I showed you just before, where the two bedrock come in contact with each other and the plants directly reflect that, because the glacial till kind of messes that up. It also messes up those drainage networks. Remember all these like rivers that the water formed? All those, that glacial till kind of messed that up. Down south in Tennessee, we like to brag that we have no natural lakes in the entire state. There's just the one from the New Madrid earthquake in the 1912 or something, where the Mississippi flowed backwards and to fill this giant hole in the ground. But otherwise, part of that is because water has had so long to work on developing these really, really good drainage networks. So every place on the land has somewhere for the water to go. Whereas up here, only 10,000 years ago, glaciers came and messed up all the drainage networks and made all these sort of places where puddles like to form. So we have lots of vernal pools and other things that just sit around on the landscape. So the surface deposits sort of dictate what you see. The topographic position, we talked a little bit about north versus south. Also just how far you are from the water table. Generally, the further up high you are on a hill, the further the roots have to reach to find the water down low. And here's an example of where it actually is the south-facing slope versus the north-facing slope. Causes that big dramatic change in forest type. You want to look at disturbance history. If there's been a recent logging event or something else where it's cut down a tree, and then there's been coppice growth where all the little side sprouts grew into new trees, other sorts of things that people have done in the landscape in the last few hundred years, or in New England, hurricanes are a pretty common event when you think over the course of a century, floods and other sorts of things that dictate disturbances. Even within old growth forests, so here's an old growth forest down in Tennessee, this old beech forest, which beech is a classic late successional species. So you have these sort of beech canopy with a beech understory, really old forests. Even within there, you have some early successional species. Like this is a tulip poplar, which is kind of like white pine. It likes to grow up in fields, but you have this big tulip poplar in the middle of this old growth beech forest. So how does that happen? Well, because you have a small scale disturbances. You have a tip up mound where a tree falls over and then it turns into this mound and it leaves this gap in the canopy. And if you look at the base of that tulip poplar I showed you before, it has this octopus-like roots where there was probably 150 years ago, the root ball of a tree that fell over that it grew on top of. So you have a very small scale disturbance, like one tree toppled over, and that's how you get an early successional tree in an old growth forest. And generally disturbed forests have more light in them, so you have more honeysuckle in this case invading the understory, you have more invasives. And when you think about the landscape context, if you're near an edge, that's also a place where you get a lot of invasives coming in. So you can see like creeping in from the edge here, the non-native shrubs coming into this forest. So you think about landscape context, and then on top of this just sort of, we have to layer on our values. So I like old growth forests, and it's just, what I like. It's something about my heart and my feeling in these places. And so that's a part of like how we see the values here. I like messy woods with lots of tip up mounds where the frogs are breeding down here, and there's some work showing that it creates more diversity in the woods when you have these sort of logs down and these tip up mounds. It's, of course, where salamanders will live under the logs and woodpeckers and all the things. A lot of people think, well, we got to clean up the logs, make it look nice and pretty. And that's a different sort of way of looking at the woods than I look at them. So it's my hope that when we think about the forest and we think about the different processes and get to know them, that we will make better decisions. And if our decision makers are, coming from this perspective of not what I think of as the forest of drywall, but the actual real forest, that our decisions in general will be better informed and will take better care of the world. So I want to end with one quote here from the book, a little reading, which is from chapter 2, which is that first part where we're going up into that place where the basalt and the Arcos met, up in that hill, the little valley there that I walked you through. And I'm walking up the trail with, I think, Juno on my back, and it's sort of a hot morning, and we're on the trail, but we decide to step off the trail because following the trail is the easiest way to be lost. Sure, that trail might take us to a preordained destination faster, but we'll have no idea where we are when we get there. While we're on the trail, we lose track of what's around us and where we are in space. We are lost. We put our trust in the trail, ceding responsibility. We give up our awareness, our senses, our minds. Our interface with the landscape boils down to just two numbers, the total length of the trail and the distance we've traveled. Staring at the path a few feet in front of us, we are not fully engaged with the surrounding world. But step off that path, and suddenly we have to look up. Look at the shape of the land and decide how steeply we want to climb. Look at the trees in the distance and pick a target to walk toward. Keep looking behind us so that we'll recognize the forest when we encounter it from the other direction on our return trip. Study the shrub layer for gaps to duck through, following the occasional animal trails worn through the denser areas. Use the network of deer paths when traversing steep slopes to gain level footing. Keep an eye out for poison ivy, rose thorns, and ticks waving their arms in hopes of catching a ride. Study the patterns of light for clearings. Monitor the changing habitats near and far, white tops of sycamores in the distance, signaling a creek, chestnut oaks nearby, telling us we've reached the drier hilltops. The banjo-like of a lone green frog calling from the wetland ahead that we hope to steer around. Keep an eye on the rising sun and remember where south is as we walk. This whole time, we maintain a map of the landscape in our heads, filling in the details as we go. That is how we get to know the world and our place in it. So with that, I will end and take any questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Noah. Give me a second to unpin and pin and.
Yeah, I'll so we can.
And we'll get you pinned in there. Oh. There we go. And I'm back. Woohoo. All right. So, wow, thank you so much. I love that you talked about building relationships with each other and with nature. I mean, that is sort of the crux of Coverts as we look to connect people to the land, to wildlife, and to each other. It is a peer-to-peer network with landowners, you know, chatting with landowners, talking about their experiences walking each other's land. So it's really connects very well with your book. So thank you so much. If anybody has any questions, go ahead and type them into the chat box and I'll be happy to relay them to Noah. Questions about your own landscape or how to look at it. I'm gonna have to go back and read the book again, I think. You know, we read it with our Coverts book group and had quite some discussions and enjoyed reading it. But there, you know, I wanna go back now with your comments and kind of reread it again.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
So,
oh yeah.
No, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just happy to take any questions if people want to unmute or type them in or whatever.
So I'm giving them a few minutes to type something in. I'm sure there's a question out there, but I'm going to ask a little more about the pieces, patterns, and process.
Yeah.
So if I'm walking out there, like, can you just dissect that a little bit for me, a little deeper?
Yeah. So the pieces are you get to identify species, like, which is maybe the first step for what a lot of us do when we're learning to be a naturalist. We learn to identify what is this plant, what is this flower, what are the animals, and we just get to know the individual pieces of the landscape. Maybe you seek or Merlin or something, right? But like we get to know the pieces, whether at a small scale or like across a large scale, like across your whole valley or whatever. And then you look at the pattern, which is either something visual you're seeing, or you just think about, okay, all of the oaks are over here, all of the pines are over here. You think about the different species and where they're occurring and yeah, whether it's like side to side or up and down, or like the density of them, or like within a forest, the layering. So what are the different pieces? Where are they in space and how, or even in time, like how are they patterning themselves? Sometimes like they might be clumped in a cluster or they might be spread out. So you think about the pieces, you think about the pattern they're in, And then you think about, okay, what sort of process would create that pattern? And that's where you try to understand like what's driving it. Why are the oaks over there? Why are the beeches down here and the pines up here? Why are things clumped over here and spread out over there? So does that make sense?
Yeah, excellent. Thank you for going to that a little further. Let me delve into the idea of the orchard and removal of invasives, right? So we talk a lot about forest health, forest resilience, and that the, invasion of different species that are not native are affecting our forests. And
Yeah.
did they replace them with something else? How has it changed? And, you know, are you arguing for not treating invasives? Tell me a little more about that.
Yeah, no, and uh it's a complex point. And so I certainly get some pushback on this, but I'm not suggesting, I'm not like advocating for invasives, right? And I think that just in certain contexts, like the orchard as an example, like they actually gave up on doing anything there. I think that everything's coming back, whatever. But it's not like there was a pristine forest that the invasives have invaded and changed. It's like an abandoned agricultural field that was like hasn't been a native place for hundreds of years. And if we were to clean up the invasives, like what would we do? Put a field in there, which is probably what they do for like the donors on campus. Like that's also not really serving much environment habitat value like a field. So replacing a invasive shrubbery thicket with like something that's just a lawn, like I don't think that really gets us much. So in that case, we could see the invasives as like, well, they are creatures, they're species, they're doing things, and the bobcats really like them. Some things really use them, the robins use them. So there's value in them. And I like those animals. So we may as well like enjoy this crazy tangle as it is and love it for its like craziness. Um, Not to say that like if we have an old growth forest or some pristine plot of land that's like invasives are starting to creep in with, we shouldn't like try to like keep them out and do all we can to kind of protect that, because they can certainly drive species to extinction in various ways, and do other things to mess up landscapes we value in all sorts of ways. I think it's just, stepping back a little bit from like invasives are bad to like, let's manage what we have in a smart way, thinking about what we want for the future. And one of those pieces is like, in conservation biology, no species is good or bad. It's like we put those values on it. And in conservation biology, there's this change to like recognizing that there is no place on earth that is untouched by humans. We have like messed up, if you will, or put our footprint on everything. And there's no real pristine ecosystems. And the ecosystems of the future are going to be different from those of the past in all sorts of ways. There are going to be novel ecosystems that have never existed, or novel communities rather. And those are going to serve certain values, whether they're sort of, you think about things in economic terms or cultural, spiritual, religious terms, or whatever, however you want to think about it. Those are going to be a set of species living there doing things. And we like in conservation biology think of those in the future as like not necessarily good or bad, but what do we want? How do we want the world to be? And in some cases, a non-native invasive plant could be part of some solution to something in a space. So yeah, I guess I'll leave it there for now if you want to push forward further on that. But
No, I think it's interesting to me the way you put values into your whole, looking at bedrock, surface deposits. I haven't ever heard, and we talk about forest ecology and what influences what's growing in the forests. We really, I haven't heard anyone really talk about values before, but obviously they were there. We had values to have sheep, and so we cleared the forests, and we had sheep because we wanted to make a living, right? And so those values imparted onto the landscape. So
yeah,
future values, I just found that very interesting.
yeah, and I'll say, I mean, I can talk about it in a lot of different ways. I'm thinking right now, I'm sitting here in this building that's like shaped like a U, and I'm on the wildlife side, and over there's the forestry side. And when we go and talk about a forest, like you know, they look at trees and like, oh, that's an unhealthy tree, that's a bad tree, and they're thinking about board feet and like what kind of timber like you can get out of that tree, and I'm thinking about like I like old growth, I like habitat, and it's just like we just, and I think there's a sort of assumption of like what is a good healthy forest and what isn't, but they're coming from different values, and so like I think often we assume we don't fully explore our value base before we jump into labeling things often. So,
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's true. And I think here in Vermont, we have a lot of discussion on ecological forestry now, and looking at it from that aspect. And it's been really great for our landowners, and we're looking forward to exploring ecological forestry even more. So
yeah,
how does that all interact? So everybody
yeah,
on the call should stay tuned for some great things
yeah,
coming in 2025 on that
yeah,
topic.
yeah.
All righty. Not seeing any questions in the chat box right now. So I'm going to give it another minute or so, because you got those burning questions, go ahead and ask them. But other than that, we've got some exciting programming that is going to be coming up for 2025, and we're working on the dates for the Coverts Cooperator Training, our 3-day program. So if you have already gone through the training, think of some of your neighbors and friends that can go through. If you haven't gone through the training, visit our website to learn a little bit more. And as I mentioned, if you found this to be an inspiring topic, please think about making a donation to support Vermont Coverts so we can continue to bring you these kinds of programs. Mostly what I'm getting is thanks, great book,
I see
really
one
enjoyed
question
it.
there. Is there a question about do we obsess with keeping things the way we are? I see that from someone there.
Oh, good, I missed that.
Yeah, and I guess I would agree. I think if we do have a fundamental sort of impulse to kind of like hold on to things. And I think it's like, for me, I've certainly like want to keep everything the way it is. It's like my fear of death and everything. I like hold on to things, don't throw out anything. And it's an impulse we have that is why we want nature. Like we feel like we want to keep nature as it was before 1492 or before whatever. And we want to hold on to some pristine vision of nature, which I still hold on to, but I also on some level recognize that nature is constantly changing, and you can't hold on to anything like glaciers in the long term or in the short term, like just forest succession, moving of species on their own. Things are going to change, and our work, I think, like there's a lot of internal work in like accepting the change in a way that is also not just giving up on our values. And I think that's the real balance and struggle with being a human today is like, how do we hold on to the things we love in nature and also accept the change that is part of nature. So I don't have an answer to that, but
Definitely dynamic and changing all the time, whether we are influencing it or weather's influencing it or just time is influencing it. So yeah, embrace the change. It's a message for today.
yeah.
All righty, everybody. Thank you so much for a wonderful lunchtime conversation. Noah, thank you for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And check out our e-news for more upcoming workshops. Noah may be joining us for our 35th celebration in September. Who knows? So yeah, lots to come in 2025. Thank you all. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.